The FBI has DNA from inside Nancy Guthrie's home. They believe it may belong to the person who took her. They have believed that for over 66 days, and they still cannot use it. Not because the sample was contaminated. Not because it was too small. Not because the laboratory is backed up with other cases and this one is waiting in a queue, but because the software required to separate the individual profiles inside that sample does not currently exist. Not in a form that the FBI has access to. Not in a form that any specialized forensic laboratory in the United States has access to right now. That is not speculation. That is not the assessment of an online commentator or a true crime analyst. That is what CeCe Moore, the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, the scientist who has personally helped law enforcement solve more than 300 cold cases using DNA evidence, said publicly and on the record on NewsNation's Truth of the Matter podcast. The way she interpreted Sheriff Chris Nunnos's statement that resolving the DNA could take up to a year is this: they don't currently have the ability to separate it. They are hoping the science advances. When she hears a 1-year timeline from an investigative agency working a kidnapping case at federal level with full resources deployed, she said that tells her that whatever software or bioinformatics tools exist at this moment are not successfully deconvoluting that sample, not partially succeeding, not producing usable results that need more time to confirm, not succeeding, deconvoluting. That word is the center of this entire forensic picture, and understanding what it means, why it matters in this specific case, and what the path forward looks like when the technology required does not yet exist, is the difference between following this investigation and actually understanding what is happening inside it. Before we go anywhere near the science, before we talk about STR profiles or deconvolution software or genetic genealogy databases, there is a woman at the center of this story who must remain at the center of it regardless of how technical the analysis becomes. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, born January 27th, 1942, someone's mother, someone's grandmother, someone's friend who showed up every single Sunday for a virtual church service without exception, until the Sunday she did not appear, and the friend who noticed that absence made the call that set everything in motion. She has been missing for 66 days. Her daily heart medication has been on her counter the entire time. Her phone is still inside the house. The blood found on the front doorstep is hers, and somewhere inside a forensic laboratory in a sample pulled from within her home is what investigators believe is biological material left behind by the person who walked through her door and took her from that house at 2:28 in the morning. A piece of evidence that should, under ordinary forensic circumstances, be able to identify that person. A piece of evidence that is currently locked behind the limits of what current science can do with a specific type of sample. That is what this video is about. Not the evidence existing, but the evidence existing and being unreachable. If you want to follow this investigation with the forensic depth that the daily coverage has not provided, click the subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. This channel examines what the documented record actually shows, what named, credentialed sources have confirmed publicly, and what the evidence actually means when you understand the science behind it well enough to grasp what investigators are genuinely facing. New analysis every time something moves in this case. And leave a comment before we go further if the software to separate this DNA does not currently exist. What do you think investigators should be doing right now while they wait for the technology to catch up? Tell me below. Let's start at the beginning of the forensic story, because before we can understand why this DNA is so difficult to use, we need to establish clearly what it is, where it came from, what has been officially confirmed, and what the confirmation actually means for the investigation going forward. In the days following Nancy Guthrie's disappearance on February 1st, investigators processed her home in the Catalina foothills neighborhood north of Tucson. That processing included the systematic collection of biological material from surfaces throughout the interior of the house. Those samples went to a forensic laboratory for analysis. On February 16th, Sheriff Chris Nonos issued an official public statement confirming the Guthrie family had been cleared as possible suspects and confirming that DNA other than Nancy's and those described as being in close contact with her had been found at the property. He added that investigators were working to identify who it belonged to and that the specific location of that DNA inside the home would not be disclosed publicly to protect the integrity of the investigation. What that statement established in the official record is precise and significant. Something biological was present inside Nancy Guthrie's home that does not belong to her, does not belong to her family, and does not match anyone investigators have identified as having had legitimate close contact with her. That unknown biological material is the evidence at the center of this analysis. But the statement also contained a word that, when CeCe Moore heard it in subsequent reporting, changed her assessment of the timeline. Mixed. The DNA recovered from the home is a mixed sample, and that single word is doing enormous forensic work in this investigation, because a mixed sample is not simply a harder version of a clean sample. It is a categorically different forensic challenge that requires categorically different tools to process. Let us understand precisely what a mixed DNA sample means in forensic terms, because the media coverage of this case has stated the fact of the mixture without explaining what it actually implies for the timeline or the process. When a forensic laboratory analyzes a DNA sample, the goal is to generate what scientists call a genetic profile, a fingerprint built by analyzing specific locations in the genetic code called short tandem repeats. Every person has a unique pattern across these markers, which is why DNA evidence is considered among the most powerful tools in criminal identification. In a clean, single-source sample, the process of generating that profile is well established. You have material from one person, you analyze the markers, you get a profile. You compare it against databases and reference samples. You either find a match or you do not. The process is reliable, routinely reproducible, and has been used to solve thousands of cases across decades. When the sample contains biological material from more than one person, everything about that process changes. Instead of one clean set of marker readings, you have overlapping data points from multiple individuals present simultaneously in the same sample. The genetic signals of 2 or 3 or 4 people are tangled together. And to use that sample for identification purposes, forensic scientists must separate those overlapping signals into individual contributor profiles. That separation process is called deconvolution. And the fundamental challenge is this: the more contributors present in a mixture, the more complex the overlapping signals become. And the harder deconvolution becomes, not just in degree but in kind. A 2-person mixture is manageable for most modern forensic laboratories using currently available software. Statistical modeling tools exist that can handle the separation with reasonable confidence when only 2 profiles are present. A 3-person mixture requires significantly more computational work, introduces greater statistical uncertainty at certain genetic markers, and demands more sophisticated software to produce results that would meet evidentiary standards in court. 4 or more contributors, and you are approaching the outer boundary of what current technology can reliably handle without introducing unacceptable uncertainty into the separated profiles. CeCe Moore, whose professional background includes leading the forensic genetic genealogy team that identified the Golden State Killer and who has worked on cases involving complex mixtures throughout her career, said in her March appearance on NewsNation's Truth of the Matter podcast that when she first heard there was a mixture in the Guthrie case, she was not immediately alarmed. Mixtures are common at violent crime scenes. They do not automatically prevent identification. In fact, she said, a mixture can sometimes be positive for an investigation because the presence of unknown DNA that clearly does not belong to any resident of the home provides stronger evidence that the unknown contributor was actually involved in the crime, rather than having left traces through innocent prior contact. The fact of mixture on its own was not the problem. The problem emerged as weeks passed without results. As the laboratory continued working on the sample and the sheriff's office continued, stating that there were challenges and that the timeline could extend 2 months or a year. Moore said she began to suspect this was not a standard 2 or 3 contributor mixture that existing tools could handle with more processing time. This was something more complex, and her public confirmation of that suspicion, delivered with the precision of someone who understands exactly what forensic laboratories mean when they describe a sample as challenging, is the clearest articulation available to the public of what investigators are actually facing. When NewsNation host Natasha Zuves pressed Moore directly and asked her whether the technology, the software itself, simply does not exist in a form that can handle this sample, Moore confirmed it. At least not in a form that the laboratory working this case and the FBI currently have access to. Those were her words. The evidence exists. The laboratory knows it is there. Investigators believe it belongs to the perpetrator. The sample has been collected, preserved, and submitted, and they cannot read it. Not yet. Because the bioinformatics software capable of deconvoluting this specific level of complexity has not yet been developed in a publicly accessible, forensically validated form. Now let us talk about where that biological material may have come from. Because CeCe Moore raised something specific about the source of the unknown DNA in her commentary on this case, and it connects directly to why the mixture is so complex. When Moore looked at the doorbell camera footage of the masked suspect approaching Nancy Guthrie's front door in the early hours of February 1st, she noticed something that most viewers focused on the backpack and the holster had overlooked. He appeared to have a flashlight gripped between his teeth, biting it to hold it while using both hands to tamper with the camera. When discussing the possible source of the unknown DNA found inside the home, Moore said she believes the sample may be saliva, the masked individual carrying a flashlight in his mouth could have transferred saliva from his mouth onto his gloves through incidental contact, and from his gloves that saliva could have been deposited onto every surface he touched as he moved through the interior of that house. A doorknob, a door frame, a light switch, a wall. Any surface he contacted with gloved hands that had oral fluid on them. Saliva as a DNA source is significantly more challenging than blood. Blood is rich in white blood cells that carry abundant nuclear DNA, tends to yield cleaner and more complete individual profiles, and is less susceptible to degradation and environmental contamination. Saliva contains a lower concentration of cellular DNA, primarily from epithelial cells shed from the mouth's lining, and is more vulnerable to mixing with environmental biological material. When saliva from one person deposits onto a surface that already bears trace biological material from other people who have legitimately touched that surface, the result is a layered, complex mixture where the relative contribution of each source is unequal and the genetic signals overlap in ways that resist clean computational separation. This is where the analytical framework of elimination becomes directly relevant to understanding the forensic picture, and where the community of online investigators following this case has been focusing a significant and growing amount of its analytical attention. When investigators find a complex mixture at a scene connected to a violent crime or disappearance, they work through a systematic process of elimination. Every person with documented access to that space over the relevant time period needs to be forensically accounted for. Nancy Guthrie's own profile would be expected inside her own home. Family members who visited regularly would be expected contributors. Close friends who came through for dinner or church gatherings. Service workers who came for scheduled maintenance, contractors who worked on the property. Healthcare professionals who may have provided assistance. Neighbors who helped with groceries or errands. Any of these people could have left biological traces through entirely innocent and routine contact. A glass used, a surface touched, a chair sat in, an item handled. Any of that could appear in a forensic sample collected from within that space. Each of those people represents a potential contributor to the mixture whose profile needs to be either matched to a known reference sample, confirming their presence in the mixture and removing that profile from the unknown portion, or confirmed as absent from the mixture, ruling out their contribution entirely. That process of systematic elimination is not a formality or an administrative step. It is the forensic foundation on which the entire evidentiary case will eventually rest. Because until every legitimate source of biological material in that mixture has been accounted for, the unknown contributor cannot be isolated with the level of confidence required for evidentiary use. The Pima County Sheriff confirmed on February 16th that family members had been cleared. That is the confirmed public baseline. What the online community tracking this case has been asking persistently and with increasing specificity is whether the elimination process extends beyond the immediate family, whether every person with any documented connection to that home, contractors, service workers, scheduled visitors, professionals who came through for any purpose over the months before the disappearance, has been formally asked to provide a reference DNA sample and formally confirmed as either present in the mixture with innocent explanation or absent from the mixture entirely. That question is not an accusation. Asking it requires no assumption of wrongdoing on anyone's part. It requires only forensic logic. In any case that may eventually go to trial, the prosecution will need to demonstrate not only that the suspect's DNA was present, but that every alternative explanation for its presence has been systematically ruled out. If any person with a legitimate connection to that household has not been formally accounted for in the elimination record, a defense attorney in future proceedings has the opening to challenge the evidentiary integrity of the entire DNA picture. Forensic completeness in the elimination process is not optional. It is the wall that keeps the evidence standing under cross-examination. The community investigating this case online has been asking whether the elimination record is complete for everyone connected to that household, and has been focused in particular on a name, the name Choni. We are going to be completely precise about what this represents and what it does not. This is a community theory. It originates from online investigators working with publicly available information, not from law enforcement statements or official confirmation. It is not an accusation. It is not a claim that any specific individual committed any crime. It is a forensically grounded question about the elimination process, whether this individual, based on whatever connection the community has identified between this person and Nancy Guthrie's household, has been formally asked to provide a reference DNA sample and formally confirmed as eliminated from the complex mixture found inside her home. The question is process-oriented, not guilt-oriented. It is the same question that a thorough, defense-proof investigation should be able to answer clearly, and the answer to which has not been made public. This channel is presenting it, labeled precisely for what it is, A community-sourced analytical question about investigative process, not a conclusion about any individual's involvement. Now, let us talk about the path forward, because understanding the limitations of the current evidence is only useful if it is paired with an understanding of what the realistic routes to resolution look like. There are three, and each has its own timeline and its own constraints. The first is deconvolution of the existing mixture. This is the path that is currently blocked. CeCe Moore said she is not without hope on this path. She said explicitly that she expects this case to spur innovation, that scientists who have been developing new approaches to complex mixture analysis now have a high-profile case creating demand for their work. The history of forensic DNA is the history of technology catching up to evidence that could not be processed at an earlier point. Cases that CODIS could not resolve in the 1990s were resolved in the 2000s. Cases that genetic genealogy could not handle in 2015 are now being solved routinely. Moore said it is not unreasonable to expect that the tools needed to process this specific mixture will exist within the timeframe Nonos described. The question is whether they will arrive in months or closer to a year, and whether they will be available to the specific laboratory working this evidence when they do. The second path is genetic genealogy from a successfully extracted profile. This is what would follow if the deconvolution problem is solved. Investigative genetic genealogy, the discipline that identified the Golden State Killer and pointed investigators to Brian Koberger in the University of Idaho murders, works by uploading a DNA profile to publicly accessible genealogy databases and searching for relatives of the unknown contributor. When a relative is found, genealogists build a family tree outward from that match, using public records, historical documents, and additional database searches to work toward identifying the unknown individual. Third cousins provide enough of a genetic connection to begin the process. The work is intensive, but it has solved cases that were cold for decades when traditional methods had exhausted every lead. The database constraint on this path is real and significant. Law enforcement can only legally upload crime scene DNA profiles to genealogy databases GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, both of which require users to have specifically opted in to allowing their data to be searched in criminal investigations. Those two databases together contain approximately 2 million profiles. The major commercial platforms, Ancestry and 23andMe, contain over 50 million profiles between them but are not legally accessible for investigative searches without court orders compelling the companies to participate. That 48 million profile gap is not a technical limitation. It is a legal and privacy landscape that significantly narrows the pool of potential family connections investigators can search. CeCe Moore was direct about how this constraint intersects with the specifics of this case. The speed at which a genetic genealogy search produces a result depends heavily on who the unknown contributor is and where their ancestry lies. If the person has deep roots in the United States and ancestry that is heavily represented in the opt-in databases, primarily Northwestern European ancestry, identification could happen in minutes or hours once a clean profile is available. If the person has recent immigrant ancestors from regions underrepresented in GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, particularly Latin America, the search could take weeks, months, or considerably longer. The proximity of Tucson to the Mexican border and the investigative interest in a possible border crossing that has been part of this case's public record makes this uncertainty particularly relevant. Moore made a direct appeal to the public about this constraint, and it deserves more attention than any coverage of this case has given it. Anyone who has taken a consumer DNA test with Ancestry, 23andMe, or MyHeritage can download their raw data file from those platforms at no cost and upload it to GEDmatch or Family tree DNA in approximately 15 minutes. The process is free and straightforward. Each person who completes that upload adds one more profile to the only databases law enforcement can legally search. The contribution of a single profile does not guarantee a match, but a match that does not currently exist can only exist if the profile that creates it is present in the database. And that profile might belong to someone watching this video right now who has never been to Tucson, has no connection to this case, and does not know that a close relative's DNA profile in a commercial ancestry database could be the link that identifies the person who took Nancy Guthrie. That is the mechanism. That is why it matters. And that is why Moore made the appeal publicly. Not because it is certain to work, but because the cost of doing it is 15 minutes and the potential impact is case-altering. The third path is the one that could bypass the deconvolution problem entirely, a second crime scene. Moore raised this explicitly in her public commentary, and it represents the most immediately actionable forensic possibility available. If Nancy Guthrie was transported anywhere after being taken from her home, both she and her captor would have left DNA behind at that location. We leave DNA on every surface we touch, every space we occupy, every object we contact. Nancy's DNA would be present wherever she was held or moved through. Her captor's DNA would be present in the same spaces. And that DNA, left in a secondary location that has not been contaminated by the complex layering that makes the interior crime scene so difficult, could produce a clean, single-source profile that can be processed, uploaded, and matched without the deconvolution problem ever arising. That is why investigators are still actively searching. That is why the $1.2 million reward remains active. That is why every tip that narrows a geographic area, every piece of information that suggests a route or a location or a specific property, is not just potentially identifying a person. It is potentially identifying a location that contains the clean forensic evidence the interior crime scene cannot currently provide. Or vehicle, a secondary property, an item discarded along a route. Any of those surfaces could carry the evidence that unlocks this case without waiting for technology that does not yet exist. The FBI has received more than 13,000 tips in this investigation. 400 federal agents and sheriff's deputies have worked this case simultaneously. The Bureau is treating it at the highest possible level of investigative seriousness, and the most powerful piece of forensic evidence currently in their possession, the biological material recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home, is sitting in a laboratory where the most skilled forensic scientists in the country are applying every available tool to a problem that the available tools cannot currently solve. Sheriff Nono's said up to a year. CeCe Moore said the science needs to advance. The FBI confirmed the sample presents real challenges. Those 3 statements from named sources who understand what they are describing, all converging on the same forensic reality, tell the story of an investigation that is not stalled by effort or by attention or by resources. It is stalled by the hard boundary of what current computational biology can do with a specific type of biological evidence, and by the legal landscape that constrains which DNA databases can be searched, with the profiles that might eventually be extracted from it. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 66 days. Her family is offering $1 million. The FBI is offering $100,000. The community following this case across every platform has not stopped watching. And somewhere in a forensic laboratory, in a complex mixture of overlapping biological signals that current software cannot cleanly separate, is the identity of the person who stood at her front door more than once, removed the camera from the wall with his hands, and carried her out of her home in the middle of a Tucson night while the rest of the neighborhood slept. The science is coming. Moore believes it will solve this case. She has watched forensic genealogy evolve from a theoretical possibility into a discipline that solves cold cases routinely. And she has been part of that evolution. The question is not whether the technology will exist. The question is whether it will arrive in time to matter for Nancy. And what every person with a commercial DNA test result sitting in an Ancestry or 23andMe account can do right now to help close that gap. If you have taken a DNA test with Ancestry, 23andMe, or MyHeritage, please download your raw data file and upload it to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA today. The process is free. The instructions are available on both platforms. That action takes 15 minutes of your time and could create a database match that does not currently exist. CeCe Moore asked the public to do this. This channel is asking you to do it, because the solution to this case might be sitting in a database right now, waiting for one more profile to make the connection visible. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit a tip at tips.fbi.gov. The Guthrie family's $1 million reward and the FBI's $100,000 reward are both still active. If this analysis gave you something the daily coverage has not, hit the like button right now and subscribe. We are tracking every development in the DNA investigation, every update from CeCe Moore and the broader forensic community, every movement in the Google footage recovery, and every development in the Bitcoin blockchain trace as this case enters its third month with no resolution. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think the breakthrough in this case will come from the DNA, from the blockchain, from the Google footage, or from something that has not yet been made public? And if you have not yet uploaded your DNA data to GEDmatch, share this video with someone who has taken a commercial DNA test. Because the profile that solves this case might belong to someone who has never heard of Nancy Guthrie. And this video is the reason they uploaded today.